How's everybody doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I am Douglas Ray, Special Assistant County Attorney at the Harris County Attorney's Office. I work for the man back here, Mr. Vince Ryan. Let's give him a hand. I've worked for Vince ever since he's been back in office, 11 years, and I was here for several years before that. I've been doing election law for 12 years now, and I managed to convince more than one judge that I'm a tremendous expert in this area of the law, so don't tell anybody. Basically, what we're here to do today is to go over election law. I've tried to tailor the handout that you're given and the presentation I'm doing to address certain types of problems that we have during elections run here at Harris County. We have a new crew running the election section over at the county clerk's office, and in that regard, I'd like to introduce to you our new Harris County clerk, just started at the beginning of the year, Diane Troutman.
Welcome. You know, the first time I met Doug was at a training in this building, and he said, "I'm about to become your new best friend." And he was right.
She looked at me like, who is this crazy?
But it's been a great partnership through these last 9 months, and it has given birth in 9 months to the countywide polling place program, which we are very excited about, and I'm sure Mr. Ray is going to share with you in this training today. But none of it would have been possible without this stellar, amazing, committed, talented team that I have here with me. I have Mr. Michael Wynn, Administrator for Elections. We have the dual roles, right? Yeah, you are in dual roles. Tanisha Hudspeth, which many of you know. She has been my administrator for communications and voter outreach. Tremendous job she's doing. In January 1st, she will take over as my chief deputy. So, I have Ms. Rocio Torres, who has just joined us from the Office of Emergency Management, who will be filling Tanisha's spot, moving right along in January once she goes to the chief deputy position. And finally, we have Jennifer Ballard. It's my fault. Yes, she knows all about elections, especially our mail ballot program, but she is now my assistant administrator for elections and could not do any of this without them. It has truly been a joint effort. And again, my thanks to the county attorney's office and Vince Ryan.
Yes, when I first met Diane the first week of January, the first thing that she did on the first Commissioners Court meeting was set an item to approve an application for a countywide polling place program. And I said, wow, this is, like maybe you should introduce yourself to the commissioners first and tell them who you are and why this would be a great program, and after you've talked them into it, then put it on the, but no, that's not the way we worked it. And it's been an interesting experience. Yes, very interesting experience. It's an old curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, we do, certainly. And Michael came aboard in January. Right before the big, voter purge, non-citizen voter purge popped up. So he got baptism by fire by being in Harris County. And I just have enjoyed very much working with these folks. One of the things that Tanisha has handed out to you is this little card. And this has been produced in reference to the countywide polling place program. And the most important thing on this is right here at the bottom of the front. It's a phone number. It's 1-833-YES-0700. So if you're wondering, if you're out, and you want to vote, if you're wondering where it is the nearest place you could vote that'd be most convenient for you, you can call this number and they'll tell you. In fact, you can just text your zip code to this number and it will send you a message telling you where the nearest polling places are. It's a very simple program. We're going to talk more about countywide polling places in just a little while. But it's something that I think everybody's going to love, especially me. All right. Also in attendance here, Mr. Ron Lewis, our city attorney for the city of Houston. One of the things we're doing this election is we've invited people that are assistant city attorneys to be on our strike teams. And the reason we do that is because we're having a big city election. It's good. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. The city hasn't actually had a big election for 4 years, so they have a lot of pent-up, energy that they want to expend on their electoral process. Some of these races have as many as, 14 people running in them? 15? Whoa. So we don't expect there to be any runoffs or anything, but that is what we're up against. We have found that when we incorporate city attorneys in our strike teams, when they go out to the polling places, there are unique city issues that come up that they're more informed about than we are. For example, there are complaints from time to time about signage. So the city people know more about what the city ordinances are about putting up signs than we do and how to enforce it. So that's just one of the issues that we found that it's important to have city people involved. Also, there are city candidates that might be more, if they're running amok and electioneering in such a way that it might be troublesome, there might be more apt to listen to a city attorney than a county attorney. That's just a couple of the things. But we appreciate your help. We enjoy having you along on this program. And I just love the fact that so many have showed up, because now I got a completely full house. All right. I gave you a handout. I hope you picked up one of these things. This has been slowly developing over the years. It's been changing. Election law is hardly static. It's been in the news a lot. A lot of things have changed since 2007. This job that I got was simple in 2007. Basically, you filled out a pre-clearance application, sent it to the Justice Department, and then you showed up on election day over in the call center and answered a few questions, and that was it. You really didn't have to do much at all. And then 2008 came, and I don't know if you all remember the Texas two-step. Okay, well, what happened was in the Democratic primary, they decided to come up with a very complicated process to pick who to be the nominee or who would get the delegate votes for the Democratic Party for president that year. You actually had to go vote, and then you had to attend a caucus. They called it the two-step because of the two-step process. And that generated hundreds of questions from people out there in the electorate as to what do I do? How do I do this? And then the following election, after Barack Obama had been elected, there was a big reaction, let's put it that way. And there were groups out there that were conservative who didn't like the way that previous election had gone, and they started very actively recruiting people to be poll watchers to prevent election fraud. And they wanted all these hundreds of poll watchers to be all over the county to watch what was going on in the polls. And there was a lot of very motivated people involved, and they felt like their job was to protect the American way. And so they were very active in a way that was inappropriate for poll watchers, and we had a lot of problems with them. And there were lawsuits, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff. So this job, over that period of time, changed completely. And it encouraged me to actually go and give lectures like this one so that you folks would know what the law is, so that you would know if you were called out or somebody just called you on the phone and said, I got this question about election law, that you would have some clue as to what the issue was and how to handle it. So, anyways, I tried to list here on the front page or the second page a list of issues that commonly come up while you're working on the election. And I've added one this year, and it is the countywide polling place program. First, the duties of an election judge. Some of them aren't too clear on what it is that their powers are or how to carry them out. But an election judge, while they're serving as an election judge, has the same powers as a district court judge. They can actually issue an arrest warrant and have somebody arrested. They could issue any kind of order that a district court judge could issue. It's explicit in the code. They have the same powers as a district court judge. This can become in handy when you show up and there's a presiding judge who says, oh, I have this problem. I don't know what to do. You can just say, well, order them to get out of here. Order them to leave the premises. Order them to stand behind that sign over there. Once you have that order in place, then we can actually play off of that order. Now, all the strike teams, typically when we have the city involved, we have one city attorney, one county attorney, and one of our investigators. There's some of our investigators right here. They will actually drive you to the polling place. They will be present while you're performing your duties. Sometimes having a peace officer with you can be very convenient. But once it is clear that you have advised the election judge what to do, and they've issued their decision as to what to do, then you can enforce it. So if they say this guy is too close to the door, and they say, I order you to move back, they say, I refuse to move back, we can take more drastic steps to move them back. Or we can call in constables and hold them and have them taken away. These are options that are available to you. And sometimes just knowing what kind of power that you have is all that's necessary. If you have enough confidence to know, I can do this, I can do that, there's justification in the law that justifies what I'm doing, then you have a lot more authority when you're dealing with folks at a polling place. It is getting kind of warm in here, isn't it? It's just my hot air. So, one of the things that election judges are supposed to do is enforce the law as to electioneering. And we'll talk a little bit more about electioneering later on. The next thing I want to talk about is the countywide polling place. What is a countywide polling place? Dr. Troutman refers to these as election centers. Okay, we've all voted, right? How many have voted early? Okay, there are 52 early polling places. They open on October the 21st. They stay open through November 1st. This year, they're open every day from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. It used to be the first week, they open at 8 o'clock in the morning and close at 4:30 in the afternoon. That's not true anymore. We have extended hours every day, except for Sunday. That's just from 1 to 6. So, what can you do when you early vote? You can go to any one of the 52 locations and cast your vote. When you check in, they bring up on the screen for you a ballot that's appropriate for where you're voting from. You could be voting, you could live in Katy and vote in Kingwood. They'll pull up the Katy ballot for you. Countywide polling places work exactly like that. On election day, you can go to any polling place, and there'll be 757 polling places throughout the county, and no matter which one you walk into, they'll be able to check you in and allow you to vote the ballot that is appropriate for you. So it's exactly like early voting. There's no more precincts. Nobody's going to be hunting around for the right place to vote. More importantly, no judge is going to say, you're in the wrong place, you can't vote here. There is no wrong place. No matter where you go, you'll be able to walk in, they'll pull up the ballot for you, and you can vote. So, one of the things that most troubled me on election day was I would get calls either from voters or from judges. It's 6:30. The polls close in half an hour. I got some poor schlub in here. He lives in Katy, but he's just got off work in Baytown. He doesn't think he can get all the way home. He wants to go ahead and vote here in Baytown. We used to have to tell him, sorry, you're in the wrong precinct. You can't vote here. If you voted a provisional ballot, it wouldn't count because you're in the wrong precinct. Now, he can walk into that polling place in Baytown. They can pull up the Katy ballot and he can vote. The same as during early voting. So no more of this precinct stuff. We actually got, in 2018, over 2,000 provisional ballots of people that voted in the wrong place that we had to send letters to tell them their vote didn't count. And I don't know how many other people walked into a polling place and didn't take the trouble to actually fill out a provisional ballot. When they told them they were in the wrong place, they just said, oh, I'm leaving. And we don't know if they ever got to the right place. I've heard stories of people who walk into one polling place. They were told they were in the wrong place. They should go to this polling place. They go to that polling place. That guy says, no, you're in the wrong polling place too. You have to go to this third place. And they get very frustrated and start calling on the phone. Do I have to go to this other place? Why won't they tell me the place I'm really supposed to go? No more of that. I don't have to take those calls. No matter which polling place they walk into, as long as they're registered in Harris County, they'll be able to vote. That's one thing that troubles me too, is that people from Fort Bend County will come over and they'll say, well, I came to the early voting. They said I could vote any place. I wanted to vote here. Yeah, well, you got to go to the Fort Bend County early polling places. You can't come to the Harris County. You have to be registered in Harris County. Now, the registration roll closed Monday. So if you're registered to vote by Monday, you can vote in this election. It's 30 days before the date that you offer to vote, you have to be registered to vote. So they're compiling the list. They've already got all the ballots programmed into the machines. They're testing them out to make sure they can operate properly, and they'll be ready to go on September or October 21st. So that's countywide polling place. That's how it works. We had to go through a process to get permission from the commissioners to apply to the Secretary of State's office, and then we had to go through and certify that we actually had, countywide support for the program, and that we had the equipment that was necessary to run the program. We had to have an electronic voting system. We had to have a system in place where we had an electronic poll book that can communicate every place so that the people who vote, the fact that they voted is updated in real time, so that if you walk into one polling place and vote, you can't just go to another polling place and vote again. The fact that you voted at the first place will be updated into the system, and everybody at every polling place will be able to tell that you already voted.
Are there other counties who are doing this?
There are like 50 other counties, 52 other counties. I actually don't live in Harris County. I live over in Galveston County, and we've had this system in place for many years. There's only 80 polling places in Galveston County. There's about 757 here. One of the advantages that we have in one of these polling places is because of the fact that people can go any place, you tend to you're able to consolidate polling places. People will get used to voting in fewer places. And because they have fewer places, it costs less because you have to have fewer judges and fewer people working on it, fewer machines, all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of concern about where we would cut back on the polling places here in Harris County. So our initial policy, the one that Dr. Troutman has announced, is that we will keep all of the polling places open, at least for 2 years. And after that, once the community has gotten used to the idea, we'll have some consultation with the community to see if there's some consolidation we can handle. If we have polling places that don't have any voters, obviously we'll want to close those. We won't want to keep those open. But there are several other counties around. I think Fort Bend County has countywide polling places as well. They instituted countywide polling places in Travis County a few years ago. And the fellow Michael Wynn that was here, who's now the director of elections, they actually hired him away from Travis County. He was the director of elections in Travis County, so he's actually been through this process before. And we brought him down to make use of his expertise. And he's just done a terrific job. People on the strike force may have to communicate with him from time to time. I think you'll find that he's very knowledgeable and that he's very to the point. Doesn't beat around the bush. He does have one quirk, though, since he's not here. If you ask him a question, say, Michael, I have a question. The first thing he'll say to you is, That's a real good question. See if he doesn't do that. That's a real good question. I wish he was still here. I'd get him to do it, and then we could make fun of him. All right. Let's talk about poll watchers. A poll watcher, the idea of a poll watcher is that if there's a witness standing around, people are less likely to misbehave. So poll watchers were instituted as a system to watch election workers to make sure that they weren't doing something that prevented voters who are entitled to vote right. Seems like a simple idea. It's been kind of turned on its head. Many poll watchers that come to our polls are not there to see to it that the election workers are doing the correct thing. They're trying to keep an eye on the voters because they're convinced that they're there trying to commit voter fraud. They're trying to sneak in with somebody else's identification. They're trying to get away with voting when they're not really entitled to vote. Imagine that. Anyways, a poll watcher has to be appointed by an authority authorized to appoint poll watchers. It can be a candidate that's on the ballot. It can be the party chair of a party who has candidates on the ballot. It can be the committee that's a proponent or opponent to a proposition. So we have a proposition on the ballot in this election. Metro is trying to get $3.5 billion worth of voted bond authority. People have, are in favor of it and against it. If there's a committee that's been set up to favor or oppose that proposition, they can appoint poll watchers. And once appointed, and the law requires that certain information be included in the appointment. It has to be in writing, signed by the appointed authority. The person who's appointed as a poll watcher will then go to the place that's specified in the appointment as to where they're supposed to watch and present it to the election judge. The election judge can then review it, and once they're accepted to be a poll watcher, they can watch whatever is going on. They're entitled to watch most everything. There's only a couple of things they can't watch. They can't be in the voting area. The law is kind of vague, and some of you will realize that this is one of the things that you'll be called out on a lot. The polling area is different in every location because each room that we set up to vote in is different. And the machines may be in a place that's fundamentally different. So I've been in places where you check in one room and the machines are in a different room. So it's pretty obvious that where the polling area is. And what this means is the poll watchers are not entitled to watch what the voters are putting down on their ballot. That is private to the voter, except in one situation. And that situation is if that voter is receiving help in filling out their ballot from one of the election workers. Then they're allowed to watch to make sure that the ballot is being properly marked by the election worker. Other than that, they have to stay away from the polling machines while the people are marking their ballots. But they're allowed to stand at a distance and watch what's going on. They're allowed to watch the check-in process. Sometimes you'll get calls saying, "This guy's crowding me. He's leaning over my back. I'm trying to check people in and he's not giving me enough room to maneuver here." And the standard answer is, he is allowed to witness what you're doing. If there's some way you can position him so it's not bothering you, you have to allow him to do that. A poll watcher can be appointed to be at an early polling place, an election day polling place, at central count, at the early voting ballot board deliberations. But the appointment has to specify where they're being appointed to watch. So they can say, precinct so-and-so at this address. They can say central count. They can say the early voting ballot board. They can say the early voting place at this address. They can't just say something in general. It has to be a specific place. Some of these guys will have a whole pack full of them signed off with blanks. And when they show up someplace, they just fill in the name and they present it. No problem with that, by the way. The poll watcher is not allowed to speak or communicate with a voter in any way whatsoever. They can't wink at them. They can't shake their finger at them. They can't speak to them. They can't say anything to them. They can't speak to the election workers except about the election, and then all they're allowed to do is to, if they observe some problem with election, the legal proceedings or the procedure, they can state, you're not doing that right. But they're not allowed to engage in a conversation. The election workers can refer poll watchers that have a problem to the election judge. Once the poll watcher reports the problem to the election judge, they are no longer allowed to engage in conversation with the election judge unless the election judge invites further conversation. Like they can say, you're not doing that right. The election judge can say, what do you mean? Well, that's not the way to do it. Well, yes, it is. Conversation over. If you invite further conversation, then they can continue to converse. Otherwise, they're not allowed to say anything further, just allowed to report it. If somebody comes in, doesn't speak English, and a conversation takes place in another language, if the person is conversing with an election worker, somebody speaks Spanish or Chinese or Vietnamese, those are the three languages we're required to provide, with an election worker, the poll watcher can require that that conversation be translated into English for him. If the voter brings somebody of their own, their brother-in-law or somebody, who swears that they'll translate for them, they are not entitled to have that conversation translated. Only a conversation that's in a foreign language with an election worker. So you can bring your sister with you. You can speak in Spanish and insult the poll watchers all you want to. They'll never be able to tell what you say. We'll see. So that's what poll watchers can do. We have in the past had many problems with poll watchers. In the 2010 election, where we had many poll watchers, what we would do is we would take colored tape and we would go out there and we'd scope out the area, and then we'd put tape on the floor and say, okay, you have to stand behind this line. You get over that line, you're out of line. And I can't believe how effective that was. And you tell them, we have to stand behind there and you can't say anything. You can, report some violation that you observed to the election judge, but that's it. And it solved a lot of problems. It worked pretty good. In fact, I think it worked so good that being a poll watcher kind of, lost its luster and decided there are more effective ways to fight voter fraud than that. All right. A poll watcher has to be a registered voter and resident of the county or political subdivision of the entity holding the election. That's a pretty easy one. Just look up their voter registration online. You can go to hctax.net. That's the website that the voter registrar maintains, and part of the information you can look up is voter information, and you can plug in any name and it'll bring up the voter registration information for that person, and that's here in Harris County. You can check it out if you need to. Anybody can serve as a poll watcher except a person who is a candidate on the ballot that day. They cannot be. And if you've been convicted of an offense that involves election fraud, you cannot serve as a poll watcher. I think all this stuff is in your handout. The central count station is on the 4th floor across in 1001 Preston, and it's not a very large room. It's a much smaller room than this, as a matter of fact. In 2018, we had about 20 people showed up to be poll watchers. They were crammed in there like sardines. We're trying to figure out a way, to accommodate people if we get a bunch of them at this election. And there's two advantages. One is that the door is made of glass, and there's a glass wall into the next room. So we're thinking we'll just let some of them in the room and tell the rest of them they have to wait their turn. When somebody leaves, they can go in. But in the meantime, they can continue to observe through the glass. And we have had individual polling places that were very small where we had to institute something like that. We had to tell some of them had to wait outside the door. We'll prop the door open so they can look through the door and see what's happening inside the room. But in the meantime, only 2 or 3 of them could actually come into the room. Now, every candidate, every party, every group that's has something on the ballot can appoint 2 poll watchers per location on election day. So you can imagine that there will be places where there could be dozens of people that could be eligible to be poll watchers to watch the same place. For early voting, you can appoint up to 7 poll watchers, but only 2 of them can serve in any one location at any given time. So the difference is that on election day, once a poll watcher shows up at a location, he cannot leave until he's been there at least 5 hours of continuous service. If he wants to leave earlier than that, he has to get permission from the election judge to leave and come back. If he leaves before 5 hours is up, the election judge can say, I'm not letting you back in here. On early voting, the poll watchers can come and go as they please. There's no time requirement. So they can show up for an hour, leave, show up for another hour, leave again. The election judge doesn't have any control over that. The poll watchers are not allowed to have a working electronic communication device. So they can have a phone, but it has to be turned off while they're serving as election judge. Now, the law basically says that if they want to make phone calls, they can temporarily leave the location to make a call and come right back in. And that doesn't constitute any break in their service. So if it's election day, the fact that somebody wants to go outside and call the party and tell them that everything's going wrong at their location, send the troops, they can come right back in as soon as their call is over. That's okay. That doesn't break their 5 continuous hours of service. But they have to go outside the polling place in order to make that call. They have to turn their phone off while they're inside serving as an election poll watcher.
Do they have to notify the election judge to do that?
I think so, yeah. It's always best to, make sure the election judge knows what you're up to. But I'm sure some of them will try to, leave and come back without saying anything. But the election judge can take the position is, I didn't know you left. You're trying to get back in. You weren't here the 5 hours. Tough beans, buddy. Out you go. So I would try to be careful if I were them. Make sure that they knew that that was the reason why that you were leaving. There may become a situation, I predict, where somebody will tell the election judge, I'm going outside to make a phone call. And when they try and come back in, the election judge will say, you were gone. You can't come back in. They'll call us up and say, they're preventing me from doing my duty. And you have to go out and actually talk to the judge and kind of work it out. That might happen. Stranger things have happened. Okay. Let me just talk about electronic communication devices. It's become very popular for people to take ballot selfies. They fill out their ballot and they take a picture of it, and then they post it on their Facebook page saying, I voted. It's perfectly okay for them to disclose who they voted for, not anybody else. But at the same time, it's a violation of the law for them to use the camera to take the picture in the first place. You cannot use any kind of electronic recording device or photographic recording device inside a polling place. So you can't use your phone. You can't text anybody. You can't look up the ballot on the internet. You can't look at it and say, I never heard of that guy. I wonder who he is. I'll just Google him and see. Cannot do that. Sometimes we have disputes between voters and the election judge based on their use of their phones. And this is an easy thing to happen, I'll tell you. Because, my elderly mother moved here from Florida, and she was unfamiliar with our machines. So I said, I can help you. I can take you to, vote, and I will help you. And we walked into the polling place down in Friendswood, and I said, I'm here to help my mother. And she goes, oh, you're not allowed to help her. And I whipped out my phone, and I said, let me show you the statute. And they go, you can't use that phone in here. I'm going, of course, duh. But the election judge came over and said, no, he can do that. He can do that. So they did let me help my mother vote. It's not that hard. She just was nervous about doing it, So it's an easy thing for people to do. And they, even perfectly innocent people trying to do the right thing can screw up occasionally. But that's the rule. You can't use that device while you're in the polling place. And it's getting more and more difficult nowadays to convince people that are, inseparable from their phone and using their phone, that they have to stop using them while they're in the polling place. And I've seen it in places where the judge has a big sign that says that they have to leave their phone outside in this basket and then come back and pick it up after they voted. Oh man, people don't like that one at all. But they also have signs that say you must turn off your cell phone while you're here. And most people comply sort of with that one. They at least put it away. But that's one of the things that I think modern life is kind of catching up to people. Like, let's say that you wanted to have a list of people you wanted to vote for or didn't vote for. How do you maintain that list? You might put it on your phone, in your notes section. You want to just pull it up so you can make sure you vote for the right people. Or you're using an electronic communication device. Tough beans, huh? Well, some people will argue about the point. So that might be something that you get involved in. Yes?
Question, smartwatches, is that treated the same as cell phones?
Yes. See my smartwatch. I can't do it.
It's 2:43.
Yeah, ask Mickey what time it is. Yeah, it is the same. And it's probably easier for people to get away with stuff. I don't know how to put a list on my watch yet, though. I'll figure it out. I'll sneak it in there. Okay, the next section we got is aiding or instructing the voters and interpreters. What kind of aid can you give to somebody who wants aid? First of all, who's entitled to aid? Most of the statutes say that people that have trouble reading or understanding a ballot are entitled to help. But federal law says that you cannot impose any kind of test on people to determine whether they're qualified to vote. So the rule is that if somebody walks in and says, I need help, they get help, period. Nobody's going to quiz them to see if they really need help or how good they can read or anything like that. As bad as some of these people want to try to do something like that, they cannot. So the election judge is not allowed to question that assertion that help is needed. Now, the voter gets to decide who helps them. And a lot of election judges are very aggressive about this. Somebody says, oh, I need help. The election people will say, oh, we can help you. You don't need your brother-in-law. You can send him outside. We can help you. The truth is that the voter gets to decide who helps. So if the voter just says, I would like one of you people to show me how to use the machine, they're entitled to have that help. The election people can't question it. Typically, the election folks are trained that if somebody comes in and wants aid with using the voting machine, they should send 2 people over there to help them. And I don't know if you know how the election judges are appointed, but they, the Democrats appoint one, the Republicans appoint one, the last election, whoever won the governor's election in that precinct, that party gets to be the presiding judge, and the other party gets to be the alternate judge. And it's preferable that one person from each party go help that person. Now, some of these places are really packed with people. It's not very convenient to try and take two people offline to help, so they just send one, but it's preferable that you have two. If the voter says, I want this person to help me, they bring somebody with them. They can bring anybody that they want to. There's only two limitations. They can't bring their boss, and they can't bring their union rep. Other than that, they can bring anybody.
Well, they can't bring an elected, right?
Yes, they
Electeds can't come in.
no. Under this circumstances, they can bring an elected official. They can, if that's what they prefer. If somebody's campaigning outside, Vince Ryan's outside, campaigning, and somebody says, Vince, I want you to come inside and help me vote. He can go in there, he can swear the oath, and he can help that person vote. The person doesn't have to be a registered voter, doesn't have to be a citizen, doesn't even have to be of age. If you want to bring your 14-year-old kid in there because you don't understand English and the 14-year-old can translate for you, you can bring the 14-year-old kid with you for that purpose. Doesn't even have to be your kid. It can be anybody, as long as they're capable of rendering the assistance that you need. And it's up to the voter to determine who that person is. This thing that he just mentioned. Elected officials ordinarily are barred. It's a Class C misdemeanor for them to be in a polling place. And if I can just convince Senator Boris Miles that this is true, my life would be a lot simpler. Unless they have some official business, like they're voting themselves, they're not supposed to be in the polling place. There is an exception. If it's a public business and they have legitimate public business elsewhere in the building, they can be in the building just elsewhere, in an area that's not observable by the polling place. Like if you have your office or one of your branch offices in that building, you can go to your office if you're an elected official. But you have to stay out of sight of the voters. But you can't just barge into the polling place and demand that they change the way that they're doing things because their constituents don't like it. And they're certainly not entitled to stand there and observe to make sure everything's going right. And you may laugh, but this has really happened to me more than once. And chasing them outside is kind of difficult. Usually what you do is you say, listen, I want to talk to you, but I don't want anybody here. Let's go outside. And once you're outside, you say, listen, you can't be in there. It's a Class C misdemeanor to be in there. Yeah, I'm going to have you cited. But when you bring somebody in to help that's not an election worker, if you bring your own person in to give aid or to translate, there are specific oaths that you have to take. I think I cited them there in the paper. One that says that you'll help mark the ballot the way that the voter wanted it marked. One is that says that you'll give an accurate translation of the material that's on the ballot. Have the assistant give that short oath. It doesn't have to be in writing. The election judge is empowered to administer that oath and have them go back and give the assistance that the voter wants. And once again, if the voter wants somebody of his own to go help, the poll watchers are not entitled to watch what they're doing. I mean, they can watch it from a distance, but they can't come up and observe the ballot to make sure it's marked in any particular way. They can do that if an election worker is rendering help, not if it's a person of their own. All righty. I see Harrison's falling asleep. You know, I see Harrison every once in a while over at Energy Park. I don't know what he's doing over there, but it looks real official. What is that you do over there? Is that some kind of security work? Yeah.
With Texans.
That must be a great job.
See all games.
Do you get to escort JJ out to his car after the game? Okay, voter ID. This has been a kind of a hot topic for a long time. Let's see if I can go through this as quickly as possible. There was a lawsuit saying that the voter identification requirements that were adopted in 2011 were too draconian, too limiting, violated people's voter rights. That lawsuit has been dismissed because we passed a new law in 2017 that adopted a scheme that was very similar to the remedial measures that the court had imposed. And the present law is the statute that was what was adopted to get out of the lawsuit. Basically, there are seven types of photo identification that are sufficient to vote in Texas. If you present one of these 7 types, you can vote a regular ballot. These 7 types are a driver's license, an identification card issued by DPS, what's known as an election identification certificate, a license to carry a handgun, a passport, a naturalization certificate with your picture on it, or a military ID. Now, there are lots of types of military IDs, so just saying a military ID is not that informative. But if you have any questions, just make sure that somebody with the Department of Defense or the Veterans Administration issues this identification and has their picture on it, and that's good. That's good enough. Now, the driver's license and voter identification card, the passport, those can all be expired up to 4 years from the date that you're presenting it as identification to vote. 4 years. Unless the voter is over the age of 70, in which case there is no expiration date that's too old. It can be a driver's license that was issued in 1942. It's still good. Still good. Did you have a question? No? The other types, the passport can be expired 4 years. They're usually issued for 10 years to begin with, so that's quite a period of time you can use one of those. And military IDs, some of them don't have expiration dates on them, some do. They can be expired up to 4 years. Now, if you don't have one of those types, you can still vote a regular ballot if you follow the following procedure. You sign a declaration. It's called a reasonable impediment declaration. It's a declaration that says, I don't have one of those types of identification. I am the voter. I swear on the voter is presenting himself to vote, and I am presenting an alternative form of identification. And those alternative forms are listed here. They're in the statute, and they're listed here in the paper. There's such things as a government-issued document that has your name and address on it. Now think about that. Let's say that Douglas Ray, on the letterhead of the county attorney's office, mails you a letter saying, I, Douglas Ray, Assistant County Attorney, am informing you of the following information, and it has your name and your address on it. That's a government document. It has your name and address. You can present that in support of a reasonable impediment declaration, and that is sufficient identification under the law. Your voter registration certificate, that's a governmental document issued by the voter registrar. It has your name and address on it. You can use that with a reasonable impediment declaration. You can use a birth certificate. The way the statute reads is if it is good enough evidence to admit into a court of law. So if it's a certified copy of a birth certificate, that'll work. There are several other things, like a bank statement, a paycheck, a utility bill. The statute says they have to be recent, and the Secretary of State's office means that they have to be less than 3 months old. So if somebody brings their bank statement from last month, has their name and address on there, they can fill out the red and present that as their identification. And one of the most common questions I get is from judges saying, this guy's got this kind of identification. Is this good? Let's say it's my mother. She never bothered to get a driver's license when she moved here. She's really old, so you can imagine, since I'm really old. She does have her Florida driver's license. It's expired, but she does still have it. Issued by a governmental agency, has her name and address on it. The address that's on your identification does not have to match the address that's on your voter registration. They don't have to be the same address. It just has to be a address. And they accept that. They accepted it. In fact, those folks in Galveston County accepted it without making her fill out a red. They said, oh yeah, this is good enough. It's good to live in one of those little counties. They don't get so technical down there. One of the most common questions I have to, tell people it's no good is a student identification card. And the reason why is most student ID cards don't have an address on them. They'll have the person's picture and name, no address. The ID card that they give me, they give each one of us here. It's got my name, my picture, but that's not my address. 1310 Prairie. That's the address of the outfit that issued it to me. If it was my address, I'd be able to use it. So, just because it's government issued doesn't necessarily mean you can use it. If it has your name and address, you can use it.
I got a question.
Yes.
Clarification on the address, you said that the addresses don't need a match, so an outdated address is okay?
Yes. Outdated. She asked me if an outdated address was okay. As long as there is an address, it doesn't have to match the address that's on the voter registration. The first thing when a person is checking in to vote that the clerk will ask is this still your address? Is this still your address? If it is, and the voter certifies that it is, they can just go ahead and vote. If the voter says, no, I've moved, then they have to fill out a form called a statement of residence. A statement of residence basically just records the new address of the person. And they can go ahead and vote after they do that. The statement of residence will be submitted to the voter registrar, and that voter registrar will update that person's information and send them a new card based on that new address. So they'll match. Yes, ma'am.
Does it have to be a physical address, or can it be a PO box?
That's an interesting question. Can it be a mailing address rather than a physical address? I would say for this purpose it can be a post office box. Yes, that address is good enough. As long as it's in the jurisdiction, I think, that, there's not much question there. There was a big to-do during the last election about people who had registered to vote at post office boxes. And if you look at the statute real close, you can see that it doesn't actually require you to provide a physical address. It says you can provide a mailing address if no physical address is available. And who am I to say whether these people are living in their cars and just using the post office box or whatever? When you register to vote, you're supposed to say where the address of where you reside. And it says if you don't have a specific address where you reside, you're supposed to describe the place good enough so that you can be located. So, like let's say that you live way out in the country someplace and you want to, give an address. You want to say, oh, I live 3 miles down this, this dirt road to the left. The reason why we want that is that we can then identify where your physical residence is located, so we can assign you to a precinct and determine who you're entitled to vote for and who you're not. There are many people that live on the street who are registered to vote here in Harris County. And what they do is they go to the local shelter where they eat and they register to vote there. They give that address. They receive mail there. And they get their voter registration card there. So there's missions downtown here that have dozens of registered voters registered at that address. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're incorrectly registered. They don't have a physical address beyond that location. So we're getting into kind of gray area there. And, Senator Betancourt made a big deal out of it, and he had people call me up, to complain about this, and I had to tell them that, the law isn't that specific. Those people are actually not breaking the law, probably. They may not have any permanent address, just an intention to return here, and they're using that as their mailing address. So, yeah, that's a good one. All right. Any more questions about voter identification? Let's say that you don't have any voter identification. You don't have any of that stuff. Not the stuff that qualifies to be used with the reasonable impediment declaration or one of the 7 official types. If you have a religious objection to having your photograph taken, you can fill an affidavit to that effect and cast a provisional ballot. Most importantly, and I've gotten this question a lot lately, If there's a natural disaster that either destroyed your identification or rendered it, where you can't access it anymore, then you can fill out an affidavit to that effect. It has to be a natural disaster that occurred within 45 days of the date that you're offering to vote. Well, guess what? We just had a natural disaster that was declared on September 19th by the governor of Texas. That's another thing. It has to be declared by the president or the governor. So, 45 days from that date is about November the 3rd. It might not cover people that try to vote on November the 5th, but it will cover everybody that tries to vote during the early voting period. They can fill out an affidavit that says they no longer have access to their identification or it was destroyed in a natural disaster, and they can submit that with a provisional ballot and have the ballot board consider whether to use that vote or not. In this situation, I believe they will. They will allow people to vote under that circumstance. But that's one thing that's unusual to this election that we have not had in other elections, if there's that natural disaster element, and there is for this election. People might ask you, what if I lost my ID in a flood? Does anybody seen American Graffiti, that movie? Where, Terry the Toad is trying to buy some liquor. He stops this old guy outside the liquor store. And he says, Terry the Toad's 16, he can't buy liquor himself. So he stops this old guy and he goes, can you buy some liquor for me? I lost my ID in a flood. And the old guy says, well, I lost my wife too, but it wasn't in a flood and her name wasn't Heidi. So, just in case somebody says, I lost my ID in a flood, you can use that joke. One of those old jokes I was talking about. All right. Let's talk about provisional ballots here for just a few minutes. A provisional ballot is something that can be offered to the voter under several circumstances. One is if they are on the voting roll but they don't have an identification. That is a special situation. Somebody that shows up is on the voter roll, they don't have an identification, they can vote a provisional ballot, and they can cure the fact that they don't have an identification by going within 6 days after the election date to an office of the voter registrar and showing the proper ID. So if they just show up, they don't have enough time to run home to get their driver's license, they can go ahead and vote a provisional ballot the next day. They can go over to the voter registrar's office, any of their branch offices here in town, and show them the driver's license, and that information will be transmitted to the early voting ballot board, and they'll count their vote. It's called curing their vote. I have heard lots of people, one of our commissioners says this all the time, that you have to cure your provisional ballot. That only counts in this situation. There's no other type of provisional ballot that can be cured. Only if you don't show up with identification and cast a provisional ballot and then bring that identification to the voter registrar's office within 6 days after election day, which is November the 11th, which I think is a Sunday, so actually you'd have to the 12th. Let's see. If you are in any other situation, you think you're supposed to be able to vote, but you're not on the voter registration roll, then you can be offered a provisional ballot. If a provisional ballot basically says, I swear I am an eligible voter who's registered in this county, and I don't know why I'm not on the list. You can submit that to the early voting ballot board, and usually people have a story that sounds something like this. Well, I went to the driver's license bureau, and they asked me if I wanted to register to vote. So I filled out the voter registration and handed it to them, and I don't know why I'm not on the roll. They have the ability down at the voter registrar's office to look up whether or not you filed an application for voter registration when you updated your driver's license or when you obtained your driver's license. They can submit to the early voting ballot board the result of their investigation. Yes, he did fill out the application and hand it in. DPS didn't forward it to us. That's very typical. In that situation, the early voting ballot board probably will go ahead and count your ballot. But it could be just about anything. Any excuse that you can think of that people think that they're registered to vote or should be registered to vote. They may have filled out a voter registration application with a volunteer deputy voter registrar. They may even have the little receipt that the volunteer deputy voter registrar gave them. But somehow it got lost in between that point when they handed it over to the volunteer deputy registrar and the voter registrar's office, and it never got recorded. That could happen. It has happened. But they should record those facts on the affidavit they fill out at the time they fill out the provisional ballot and submit it. And the early voting ballot board reviews these. And one of the main reasons why they've rejected it in the past is that thing I referred to back at the beginning, that they were in the wrong polling place. They were in the wrong precinct. They weren't entitled to vote where they offered to vote. No more of that. You should be careful with this issue. There's a woman up in Dallas or someplace like that. She had just gotten out of prison. She had been a convicted felon. She was still on probation. And her mother dragged her down to the polling place to vote. Well, naturally, her name wasn't on the roll. She had been a convicted felon. And the election judge said, well, why don't you just go ahead and vote a provisional ballot? Part of the provisional ballot says, I swear that I'm a person who is eligible to vote. Well, the Attorney General's hit squad found her and had her locked up for 5 more years on the basis of election fraud. And she said, I was innocent. I told them that I didn't think I'd be able to vote. They were the ones that talked me into doing this. You know, I didn't mean to break the law. If they don't want to count my vote, don't count my vote. So listen if you get any calls or if you run into a situation where, you know, an election judge or a person who's a voter is, you know, in a situation where they're not on the roll and they are being offered a provisional ballot, make sure that, you know, the situation is not going to run into problems like that. Okay. Now, I promised some ethics. I'll tell you some ethics. If you look at the Rule of Professional Responsibility 1.12, I think that's entitled Representing an Organization. When we're doing this job, we're representing an organization. We're representing the Harris County Clerk's Office, Harris County, the election folks, the election judges. These are an organization. Your responsibility is to make sure that the law is enforced, that the organization ends, that the governmental purpose is carried out. It's not to do what the election judge tells you to do. You must make that very clear to the election judge. Although you're there to represent them, you're representing them as an agent for a bigger outfit, an agent for Harris County, that they're part of the overall operation, that you're not just there to do whatever they tell you to do, even though they might have the power of a district court judge. If you look at comment number 9 under 1.12, it actually specifically addresses your responsibility to an organization if you're a governmental lawyer. It says that you are responsible to the government even though you may answer to a specific department or a specific elected official. You are responsible to the government entity, Harris County, not to the county clerk's office, not to the election judge, not to the county attorney, but to Harris County. So, or the city of Houston. That's your responsibility. You may be in a situation where you want to push back, you want to question, you want to make sure that the official is actually following the law. You have a great deal of breadth of responsibility to do that, much more so than if you're in private practice and trying to deal with your own client. You're trying to make sure that they follow the law. You're trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And you should never forget that. That's your primary responsibility. I hear, you know, stories every day about lawyers working for governmental agencies that are doing all kinds of twisty-turny things to satisfy their higher-ups. And I'm thinking to myself, what? They have lost their way. They do not work for that guy. They do not work for that department. They work for the United States government. They work for the state of Texas. They work for Harris County. They work for the city of Houston. That's their client, and that's who they hold their responsibility to. So, anybody have any question? Boy, this room really has stifled everybody, hasn't it? I see Lamont back there sleeping. I mean, he never sleeps.
John,
Yes, sir.
you don't have any sign in the yard issues inside the county but outside of the city?
Do we have any sign in the yard ordinance? I think that, I think
Issues.
the only sign issues we have to do with signs that are put up in the right of way.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you have signs, so outside, let's say outside of the city, and for purposes of this conversation, outside of the ETJ, somebody's got a house and you've got a right of way, and they have put a sign in the right of way, and you'll restrict that activity?
I believe we do. We have an actual program that where people can go and sign up to be deputized to remove signs like that. Yeah. We
So-
do have that.
Do you have people contend that because they've got a fee interest in the dirt, that they're entitled to have the sign wherever they want?
I've never heard that one. I would have to consider it. Their interest in the dirt, though, would be subject to the right-of-way rights, which I think would supersede their right to be able to put a sign in there. That's the way I would interpret it. Now, I know that Tracy and I have dealt with people that put up very large signs at polling places, typically over at the Metropolitan Service Center, that violate city ordinances, and you know, that's something that's kind of outside my level of expertise. I wouldn't know exactly how or when or who would be able to handle something like that. But I don't think that's the only place that we've run into situations like that. Polling places are required, if it's a public place, to allow electioneering on the grounds outside the 100-foot limit. So if somebody's electioneering, they can come up within 100 feet of the entrance and electioneer all they want to. But in private places, what we've been doing for the last several years is when we sign the lease agreement to use that location as a polling place, we provide in the contract that they're going to allow electioneering outside the 100-foot limit. So they do have to allow electioneering to anybody that wants to electioneer, as long as they're more than 100 feet from the door. That's the entrance to the polling place. But we do that by contract. A public place is required by law to allow electioneering. And electioneering typically during the election period does allow you to erect signs. Now, a public entity, and I think even a private landlord, can impose reasonable restrictions on those signage, but they can't prohibit it altogether. I know of one polling place where the folks showed up and put up these, 4x8 signs all up and down the road in front of the building, and the pastor whose church it was got upset and made them take it all down. And we went out there and we had to work with them more than once to convince them that they had to allow signage, that they wanted to have restrictions of that type. They had to publish basically regulations that they could hand out to whoever's going to electioneer that were consistently enforced. I don't know if that answered your question or not. But you're just talking about people that put up a sign in front of their own house and not dealing with some kind of polling place. I'm not sure that we ever get really into much of that kind of
In
thing.
local communities, what they do is, most cities, they'll tell you, so you can't put signage up earlier than 30 days in your yard. If it's along the freeway, then it has to be a certain footage from the middle of the freeway. We're getting ready to sue that right now in our department.
Mhm.
That they have to be a certain footage from the middle of the freeway up to that, because that's owned by the county and the city.
Right.
They cannot be placed there. They're illegal. And if they're on private property, then that's okay. But they're illegal any place in that area.
Yeah, I think that what Mr. Lewis is referring to is that there's lots of properties that at the time that the road was built, they didn't acquire a fee interest in the right-of-way. They acquire an easement that allowed them to put a road over privately owned property.
That's different, yes.
Yeah. So the tree lawn, what I would call the tree lawn, the little lawn outside the sidewalk, is actually technically owned, like my house, I own all the way to, you know, a certain point, and beyond that, it's owned by the city, and they can regulate the area, you know, that's between the right-of-way line and the edge of the curb. And in other situations, you'll actually own less than all the way to the curb. They'll own, you know, a certain distance in there, but they impose upon the adjacent landowners a duty to maintain that area.
It's an easement, they have an easement,
Mhm.
right to have the easement, so they can go through and put up high lines.
Or, yeah,
Sure.
or whatever it is that they want to. But I think in situations where, you know, we have an easement that gives us right of control, we can certainly prohibit signs for safety reasons, if for nothing else. I know that a lot of deed restrictions are imposed by homeowners associations that some of them say they prohibit signs outright, but those are unenforceable provisions. Some of them have things that say you can put up signs of a certain size or, you know, within so many days of an election, but those are hard for them to enforce. But I know that such regulations do exist in these places. For the most part, we have not run into that as a major problem, except on election day at a polling place where some very large signs are being erected.